Arizona Territory, late autumn 1882. Sun hammered low, wind sharp with sage and iron. Before we ride farther, please like this video. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the next trail. Set your boots, breathe the desert air, and listen. The land is patient, and tonight it watches a solitary rider. Stay close. The ridge keeps its secrets until dusk and cold. His name is Elias Ward, 41. Former Union scout who reads horizons like ledgers, carefully without romance, counting what remains and what is gone. A pale tug under his left eye marks where war signed its initials. The rest of his scars live in his posture. Now he trades horses and words in equal austerity, preferring the sure breath of a gelding to the chatter of town men. His cabin keeps to the bluff, a square of order on rough country. Morning finds him early. He wakes when the desert hasn't chosen between frost and fire, grinds coffee by hand, and drinks it black as canyon shade. He counts what requires counting: nails, salt, lamp oil, rope, and lays out his day like fence posts, one task steadying the next. He listens like a wary man, to the well bucket's click, to mesquite in wind, to hoof marks faint in dry creek silt. When he rides, leather answers in familiar creaks. Work is the scripture he trusts, rails to mend, leather to oil, a corral gate that drifts when gusts grow stubborn. The canyon asks in many tongues: hawk shadow, lizard flicker, a jay's saw. And Elias replies with the sermon of a hammer and the amen of sweat. He speaks to animals better than to men, and they repay him in the currency he values most: unvarnished behavior. Town is a reluctant errand. Once a month he rides in, buys coffee and needles and tobacco he pretends is for guests he never has. The last time he lingered, a drifter asked about the scar. Elias finished his whiskey, swallowed his answer, and rode home through starlight a little too sharp. Home is a narrow mercy. The cabin smells of pine pitch and coffee grounds. With a ghost note of a woman's soap the air refuses to forget. On a shelf sits a small wooden box. Inside, a lone iron spur. Beside it, a crow feather black as a closed book. He keeps them the way desert people keep water, sparingly, for the weight memory adds to a light room. Late autumn pairs everything to essentials. The creek is a wire, the sky a bright blade, and distances precise enough to measure a lie. Sun falls in long planks over broken country, and each evening leans a breath closer to snow. It is a season that does not bargain. It simply requires. Elias fits the requirement. He has made a life from low demands honestly met, from silence that wears him like a coat already paid for. Even an honest life has hinges, and wind loves a door that thinks it is secure. On afternoons, when the trail bends around knife-back ridges and the arroyo sleeps dry, Elias rides the high line and studies the ground. A scuffed stone, burrs clinging wrong in a mane, two colts testing a rotten post. He follows their marks with the patience of a man who has outlived impatience. The land, like grief, cannot be hurried without cost. Stand beside him now, brim low, and see what the country sees. A man pared to useful edges, content with enough. Far hooves, maybe cattle, maybe not, drum an unreadable time. He guides the gelding along a trail, as narrow as a thought not yet ready to be spoken. He draws rein at a cut in the bluff, and listens as he once listened when listening meant living. The world answers with a small catalog: cricket stitch, raven scold, leather flex. Nothing argues, nothing announces. The desert prefers that kind of quiet. Another bend, and the ridge lays a ribbon of shade across the path. Like a closing eyelid, air cools. Beyond the chaparral, movement gathers. A rustle not made by wind. A rhythm wrong for cattle. The gelding ticks an ear forward. Elias sits a fraction taller, not alarmed, not relaxed, awake. He has known evenings when the next breath decided a year. This is our threshold, the last calm sentence before the story clears its throat. We have the place, the weather, the man, and the make of his silence. Keep your hands light on the reins and your eyes level with the falling sun. Something is about to step from the brush, and teach him what his quiet is for. When it does, every mark the past left on Elias Ward, the near silent scar, the disciplined solitude, the careful counting, will meet its measure and find it changed. The fire burned low, a thin tongue of orange flickering against the soot-black stones. When Elias Ward understood that the night had changed the air between them. The desert was always stingy with warmth, and he had long grown accustomed to letting silence do the talking. But now the silence was different, no longer a wall to keep the world out, but a roof, a kind of shelter that pressed them closer without a single word being spoken. The Apache woman he had pulled from death's teeth had not offered him a name yet, but she had offered him something rarer, trust enough to bind his wound. He had watched her eyes as she worked, dark and cautious, but unshaken. The eyes of someone who had learned that strength meant standing steady when the ground beneath you broke. He knew such steadiness, for he had walked through battlefields where smoke turned day into dusk and men shouted orders no one heard. It was the same steel he saw now, wrapped in a quiet figure who sat near the hearth, barefoot and bruised, yet upright, with a pride the arrow had not stolen. Elias lay back on his cot, the weight of her presence pressing into his thoughts. He told himself she was only here because he had carried her, only here because nightfall and cold left no other choice. Yet even as he closed his eyes, he knew the truth was more complicated. He had not saved her for duty's sake. He had saved her because something in her running had struck a chord in him, a music he thought long buried beneath years of loneliness. By dawn, frost laced the cabin's single window, and smoke from the rekindled fire curled thin as parchment. Elias rose slow, careful with the arm that throbbed with dull ache. He found her already awake, wrapped in the blanket he had given, her gaze flicking toward the door as though expecting pursuit. She moved like a deer at the edge of water, ready to drink, ready to flee. He said nothing, only poured water into the coffee tin and let the scent spread rich and bitter. At last she broke her silence with a single word. Sana. Her voice was low, as though testing whether names still mattered. He answered with his own, Elias, and the exchange was simple but enough. In that moment, the cabin ceased to be his alone. The air held two names now, and the desert beyond the walls felt less endless. She did not thank him for the arrow he carried in his flesh, and he did not ask her why men had hunted her like game. Gratitude and confessions were luxuries they could not afford. What they shared instead was survival. Bread divided, fire stoked, buckets carried, branches gathered. Her steps were soft, but every move was certain, practiced. She swept his floor without asking, mended his sleeve with quiet hands, carried water as though it were a duty she had always known. Elias let her, not out of need, but out of respect. He sensed she was claiming space, shaping the cabin into something she could endure. And he found, to his own surprise, that he did not mind. As days passed, a rhythm grew between them, built not with words, but with glances and the weight of small actions. She kept close to the windows at dusk, her eyes scanning the horizon as though she could still hear the hooves of those who hunted her. He cleaned his rifle more often, hammering loose planks against the east wall, preparing for a return that might never come. One evening, beneath a sky hard with stars, he handed her the knife he had been sharpening. She tested the edge, nodded once, and returned it without a word. In that exchange, he felt the first stirrings of something more than protection, an unspoken vow, not that he would shield her, but that they would stand together if the desert brought danger back to their door. She no longer seemed like a hunted girl crouched by his fire. She was a woman who had chosen to remain, to claim her own ground. And in that choice, Elias discovered the beginning of belonging. Nights grew colder, the wind carrying the taste of snow from higher ridges, and the fire became their common anchor. One evening she sat near him, close enough that her shoulder brushed his, and asked the question that had waited between them since the arrow struck. Why? Elias did not answer right away. He thought of the war, of men he had seen fall in mud and smoke, of moments when instinct drove him into the path of steel, not because it made sense, but because letting another man die was worse. He thought of the years since, of silence gnawing like hunger, of a life pared down to wood smoke and lonely meals. At last he said simply, "Because you didn't deserve to fall before them." She looked at him for a long moment, her eyes unreadable, then nodded. It was not thanks she gave, but something stronger, acceptance. He felt it like a hand pressed against the scar, steady and real. That night she spread her bedroll nearer the hearth, but angled toward him, as though she too had decided that the silence between them was no longer emptiness, but something to be lived in. And so the days bent into a new shape. The canyon wind still howled, the land still asked for labor, and the threat of men lingered beyond the ridge. Yet the cabin no longer echoed hollow. Two figures moved within its walls, two lives stitching themselves together in the small acts of mending, tending, and enduring. For Elias, who had once thought quiet was his only companion, the sound of Sana's steady breathing at night was a revelation. For Sana, who had fled the weight of chains disguised as tradition, the scar on his arm was proof of a man who chose her survival over his own ease. In that narrow place between fear and firelight, something fragile began to grow, not peace, not yet, but the first steps toward it. And though neither dared to name it, the desert knew. Two lives, once scattered like dust, had found a place to settle. The frost along the window had barely melted when the rhythm between Elias and Sana shifted into something stronger. No longer the fragile balance of two strangers, but the slow weaving of a life that felt like it could last. He woke each morning to the sound of her steps, moving softly across the floor, not in retreat but in purpose, stirring embers, pouring water, steadying the fire before the cold could claim the cabin. She was no longer the hunted figure he had lifted from the dirt. She was the woman who had chosen to remain, who mended his shirt with the same quiet conviction she used to bind his wounds. And Elias, who once thought his solitude unshakable, found his days bending toward her without realizing he was yielding ground. He noticed the way her eyes tracked the hills when he rode out to check the fence, how her hands tested the latch of the door before nightfall, how she always listened for sounds he had trained himself to ignore. She carried the caution of someone who had been betrayed by both her people and the settlers who hunted her. And yet, she had not fled. That choice, that silent declaration, pressed against Elias's heart, heavier than any arrow he had ever taken. For the first time in years, the quiet around him was not empty. It was inhabited, and in that shared silence, he began to feel the stirrings of home. It was on one such morning, when the frost still clung silver to the grass, that Sana knelt near the fire and began to unwrap his bandage. He sat still, his arm bared, watching, as her hands moved with care, cleaning, binding, tightening the cloth, until the wound lay hidden beneath her work. She did not speak at first, but when she tied the knot, she let her hand rest a moment against the scar, not in pity, but in gratitude. Her eyes lifted to his, steady, unflinching. "My mother was a healer," she said quietly. "She tried to teach me before they married me off." The words carried no tremor, but Elias felt the weight of them. He wanted to ask more, but he had learned not to press. So he only said, "She taught you well." That small acknowledgement softened her shoulders. And for the first time, her silence did not feel like defense. It felt like trust, being offered one slow word at a time. As the days grew shorter, their routine deepened. Elias worked the fences, split logs, checked the traps, while Sana swept, mended boiled water, and prepared meals with the precision of someone used to doing more with less. But it was not duty alone that moved her hands. She was carving space into his life, shaping the cabin into something that belonged to both of them. At night, when the wind rattled the shutters and the fire burned low, she no longer lay apart near the hearth. Instead, she spread her blanket beside his cot, close enough that the warmth of her breath touched his shoulder in the dark. They did not speak of what it meant, but when she reached for his hand under the quilt, her fingers cold, his grip tightened around hers without hesitation. And in that simple gesture, the silence between them spoke louder than any vow. One evening, as clouds rolled heavy across the stars, and the canyon echoed with the cry of coyotes, Elias returned from checking the west trail to find Sana outside, breaking kindling into neat stacks. Her hair was braided tight, beads glinting in the firelight, the feather he had given her tucked into the leather tie. She looked up when he approached, her face marked not by fear, but by decision. "If they come again," she said softly, "I won't run." Elias set his rifle against the wall and met her gaze without flinching. "You won't have to?" No more needed saying. They both understood. The hunted girl was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to claim her life. And he, scarred and weary, knew he would stand with her as long as he drew breath. Winter pressed harder. In the weeks that followed, the cabin became their refuge, each day measured by the rhythm of shared labor and the comfort of each other's presence. He sharpened his knife while she mended her dress, and when he offered her the blade to test the edge, she returned it with a nod that felt like a promise. One night, when the fire cracked and shadows leaned close, he pulled from his box a crow feather he had kept since the war. Never knowing why, he held on to it. Without words, he offered it to her. She took it in both hands, her eyes softening for the first time since he had known her. "Thank you," she whispered, the second thing she had spoken to him since arriving. Elias only nodded, but his chest ached with a warmth he had not allowed himself in years. As storms swept down from the high ridges, rattling the cabin and painting the land with frost, they drew closer still. One night, Sana shifted her blanket beside his, her hand tracing the scar beneath his eye. "Was it war?" she asked. He nodded. "Cold Harbor." She smiled faintly. "I thought men like you didn't flinch." His answer came quiet. "I do, just not when someone's looking." That made her laugh, soft and unguarded, and the sound filled the cabin like light. She pressed closer, and in the hush that followed, they found each other not as survivor and savior, but as man and woman who wanted, who chose, who belonged. No kiss was needed, no vow spoken. Nard, the way her hand lay over his heart was enough. By the time spring brushed the canyon with wildflowers, the snow melted into the creek, and the air smelled of pine and damp soil. The scar on his arm had healed into a raised line, a mark of the choice he made the day he turned into an arrow's path. Sana still wore the feather at her temple, still swept the cabin with quiet certainty, but now her steps carried something new, a steadiness not born of fear, but of belonging. When Elias stood beside her on the porch, watching the land awaken, he no longer felt like a man waiting for silence to end. He felt like a man who had finally found what the silence was meant to hold. The weeks turned themselves into a kind of rhythm neither Elias nor Sana had named, yet both understood in their marrow, as if the land itself had begun teaching them how to share it. Each dawn arrived cold, the canyon wrapped in mist like breath rising from an unseen mouth, and Elias woke to the sound of her steps moving across the cabin floor, light but sure, as though she had always belonged there. She stirred embers back to flame, poured water into the kettle, and kept her silence steady. Not because she was withholding anything, but because silence was the ground she had walked on all her life. Elias watched her sometimes, the way her braid caught the fire's glow, the way her hands moved with purpose, and he realized the cabin no longer felt like a shelter meant only to keep him alive. It was changing into something else, something warmer, though neither of them dared call it home just yet. Outside, the wind leaned against the walls and rattled the shutters, but inside, the quiet they carried together grew into a language all its own. They worked side by side, as if they had been doing so for years. Elias patched the fence posts that leaned toward collapse, his arm stiff but steady, while Sana carried water for the horses, her bare feet careful over the frozen ground. At midday, they gathered branches near the ridge, her eyes flicking to the horizon with the watchfulness of someone who never forgot danger could return. She swept the dirt floor of the cabin without needing to be asked, straightened his cot with the same patience she used to mend her own torn dress. And when he offered no objection, she understood that his silence was not refusal. It was acceptance. Elias noticed how she handled tasks as though she was testing the cabin itself, seeing if it could hold her weight, if it would let her remain. And he found himself watching her more than the fences or the sky, realizing that each small act she made was weaving her into the fabric of his days. At night, when the fire burned down to low coals, she sometimes came to sit beside him at the table, wrapped in a blanket, her dark eyes catching the glow. They did not speak much. Words were scarce and often too blunt for what they carried, but there were glances, brief and heavy, that said more than confessions could. One evening, he took his knife from his belt and began sharpening it by the door. Without asking, he handed it to her. She turned it in her hands, tested the edge, then passed it back with a nod. The exchange felt like a vow, a quiet promise that they were no longer two strangers bound by chance, but two lives beginning to tether themselves by choice. The cabin, once filled with the echo of loneliness, began to carry traces of her presence. A folded rag drying near the hearth, beads she rewove into the hem of her dress, a small pouch she set carefully by her bedding. Elias caught himself listening for her movements, the way he once listened for wind through broken rails. And when he didn't hear her, he missed it. He saw her eyes at dusk, always checking the windows and doors, her body tense with memory. And he found himself preparing alongside her, setting his rifle against the wall, hammering planks to close drafts. They never spoke of the men who had hunted her, but their silence about it was not avoidance, it was readiness. One night she looked at the rifle and asked, "You think they'll come?" He shrugged. "Don't know." Just in case she stared at him for a long breath, then said, "If they do, I won't run again." His reply was simple, firm. "You won't have to." And in that moment, something changed. She was no longer the woman he had saved. She was the woman who had chosen to stay and stand. The winter pressed deeper, frost threading the windows, snow threatening from the high ridges. Elias stacked wood higher inside, while Sana stitched quilts and mended seams with neat, strong fingers. One night, when the wind screamed against the walls, she moved her blanket beside his cot without asking. Her hand brushed his beneath the cover, cold but certain, and he did not pull away. Their nearness spoke louder than any vow, and in the dark, with the fire's glow faint against the walls, he felt her head rest against his shoulder. He realized then that the silence he had once feared was no longer emptiness. It was a kind of fullness he hadn't known he was starving for. One evening, as clouds rolled thick, across the stars, he opened a small wooden box from the shelf. Inside was a crow feather, black as midnight, something he had carried since the war without knowing why. He walked to her, bent low, and offered it. Her eyes widened, surprise breaking through her guarded calm, and she took it carefully, holding it with both hands. "Thank you," she whispered, the third word she had ever spoken since arriving. That single phrase carried more weight than any declaration he had ever heard, and Elias felt his chest tighten with something he could no longer deny. She tucked the feather into her braid, and when she looked at him again, there was no more distance left to cross. Through these nights, through the steady ache of healing and the work of survival, something larger grew in the spaces between them. Not yet love, not yet peace, but the slow-burning fire of belonging. Elias, once resigned to live out his days in silence, felt the years of loneliness begin to peel away like old bark. And Sana, who had carried the weight of exile and fear, began to stand taller in the small room they shared. And though the world beyond the ridge still carried its dangers, settlers with arrows, lawmen who would not understand, memories that would never loosen, their quiet was no longer brittle. It was strong enough to hold them both. The cold months thickened into something heavier than frost, a silence woven with watchfulness. And it was in that hush that Sana began to share the shadows of her past. Elias had not asked. He was not a man to pry at wounds. But one night, as she unwrapped the old bandage from his arm and set fresh cloth against the scar, her voice came low, even as though spoken more to the fire than to him. "They promised me to a man older than my father," she said, steady but bitter, the words shaped like iron that had burned her long ago. "Wanted me quiet, wanted me obedient. I said no." She paused, tying the cloth with a precision that betrayed no trembling, but her eyes did not lift. My uncle called it rebellion, said I was cursed. The elders believed him. Elias listened, jaw tight, breath slow, because he knew enough of war and men to understand how cruelty often found the easiest target. He did not speak. Not yet. Sana continued, her voice sharpening. They told the settlers I stole a horse. Made me quarry for their rage. She set the bandage, tied it firm, then leaned back. Settlers don't need much reason. Just someone brown enough to take the blame. Her eyes found his then, searching hard, like she expected judgment. But Elias only nodded, slow and certain. That's no crime, he said. The faintest exhale slipped from her lips. Not relief, not forgiveness, but something like the recognition that he believed her. After that night, her silence became less guarded. She moved through the cabin with the quiet steadiness of someone who had been denied a voice too many times. But her eyes, when they met his, no longer flinched away. She carried water to the trough, split kindling with sure hands, mended seams on his trail coat with stitches strong and straight. And Elias, watching her, began to feel that each act was more than survival. It was a declaration that she was no longer hiding. One morning, as he tightened the saddle straps, he asked softly, "Ever lived off alone before?" She hesitated, then said simply, "Yes." He waited, but she did not explain, and he did not press. Her silence was no longer a wall, it was a choice, and he respected it. In the evenings, the fire drew them together. Elias cleaned his rifle slowly, while Sana mended the hem of her dress, her beads catching the flicker of flame. He noticed how her braids grew neater, her eyes clearer, the bruises fading into memory. She was no longer just surviving the hours in his cabin. She was shaping them, altering the silence into something that bound them both. One night she set aside her mending, folded her hands in her lap, and spoke without looking at him. "They called me cursed because I would not bow, because I chose to walk away." Elias's hand paused over the rifle barrel. He looked at her steady. "That's not a curse," he said. "That's freedom." She met his gaze, her lips parting as if to speak. But instead she reached across the narrow space between them, her hand settling over his. It was not gentle, not fragile. It was firm, present. "You don't have to fix me," she said. "I'm not trying to," he answered. Her thumb brushed his knuckles once before retreating, but the warmth lingered long after. The cabin grew into a place where scars were not hidden, but carried in plain sight. She touched his wound when she changed the bandage, not with pity but with reverence, as though honoring the moment he had stepped into the path of an arrow for her. He noticed too the way she scanned the horizon at dusk, her shoulders taut, her jaw set, a woman who knew danger might still come. And so he prepared alongside her, checking locks, testing shutters, loading rifles. They said little, but both knew that if those riders returned, they would face them together. When she told him one evening, "If they come, I won't run again," he met her eyes and said simply, "You won't have to." That was the night she pulled her blanket beside his cot, without hesitation, and when her hand found his beneath the cover, cold but certain, he did not let go. As winter deepened, their silences grew warmer, filled with the weight of things neither had spoken but both understood. Elias had once believed his solitude was final, carved into him like stone. Now, each day he spent beside her revealed how silence could be more than emptiness. It could be a place built by two. For Sana, who had been cast out by her own and hunted by others. The scar on his arm became a symbol, not of pity, but of a man's choice to stand between her and death without question. And for Elias, who had carried his own ghosts too long, her presence was proof that the quiet he had lived in was never meant to be endured alone. It was a fragile bond, made not of vows or promises, but of bread divided, fire tended, wounds bound, and trust shared in glances. Yet in the harsh stillness of the canyon, fragile things had a way of enduring longer than anyone expected. And though danger still lingered beyond the ridge, though the world would never welcome them, the cabin had become a sanctuary where exile and scar could rest side by side. It was not yet peace, but it was the beginning of something that might, with time, grow into it. The days that followed stretched long and taut, like wire strung across the canyon, for the peace inside the cabin was shadowed now by the knowledge that eyes beyond the ridge had seen what Elias had meant to keep hidden. The young rider with the easy grin had come and gone, but his presence lingered like a thorn beneath the skin, a reminder that danger did not always thunder in with arrows and shouts. It could arrive smiling, asking about horses, pretending at courtesy while memorizing every detail that mattered. Elias felt it in his chest as he split wood, his arm still stiff but healing. He felt it in the way the gelding snorted at night, ears pinned to sounds Elias could not hear. And Sana felt it too, though she never said the words. Instead, her eyes lingered on the west trail long after the man had ridden off. And her hands, steady as they worked the wash or set bread to rise, betrayed the tension of someone who expected pursuit. Yet she did not falter, did not ask to leave. She stood taller in those days, her silence harder, not from fear, but from decision. One evening, when the fire snapped and shadows pooled thick in the corners, Elias saw her watching the rifle leaned by the door. She asked, her voice low, "You think they'll come back?" He met her gaze without hesitation. "Don't know." Just in case, she looked at him a long moment, then nodded, and her words came like steel. "If they do, I won't run again." His answer was as simple as it was certain. "You won't have to." That exchange marked a shift, neither of them named aloud. The hunted girl was gone. In her place stood a woman who had chosen not only to survive, but to stand. And Elias, who had thought himself nothing more than a scarred man clinging to solitude, realized he had been waiting all along for someone who could meet him in that silence without fear. In the mornings they worked as they always had, he checking the corral and the fences, she boiling water and sweeping the cabin, but the air between them was different, heavier with resolve. At night, after supper, she no longer sat apart, but closer, sometimes shoulder to shoulder, her hand brushing his beneath the table, her warmth anchoring him as the wind rattled the shutters. Their silences, once wary, grew into a bond thick with unspoken promises. He sharpened his knife beneath the starlight, and she stood beside him, wrapped in her blanket, looking out across the desert as though measuring the distance between past and present. When she finally sat, her presence beside him was not tentative. It was deliberate. He handed her the blade. She checked the edge, nodded, and gave it back. It was a simple act, but Elias knew it for what it was. A pact forged in silence, a promise that neither of them would face what came alone. The days cooled, the wind sharper now, dragging winter across the canyon floor. Elias hammered a plank over the loose board on the east wall, while Sana mended the hem of her dress, the beads shining clean and new beneath the firelight. He watched her hands moving, patient and precise, and felt something stir inside him he had nearly forgotten, the fragile pulse of wanting more than survival. That night, he reached into the drawer and drew out a small box, lifting from it a crow feather he had carried since the war. He had never known why he kept it, only that it belonged to him in a way nothing else did. Now, he bent low and held it out to her. For a moment she hesitated, surprise flickering in her dark eyes. Then she took it in both hands, holding it as though it were sacred. "Thank you," she whispered, the third word she had given him since she had come. Elias only nodded, but in his chest, something long locked away shifted free. When she tucked the feather into her braid near her temple, he knew it was no longer his burden to carry. It was their symbol, a marker of trust, of shared ground, of belonging. That night, when the fire burned low and the shadows crept close, she swept the hearth as she always did, but her movements were slower, thoughtful. Elias leaned his rifle against the wall, eyes on the door more than usual, knowing that the threat of riders from Dust Vale still loomed like a storm on the horizon. Sana saw it too. She paused, looking at the weapon, and when she turned to him, her eyes carried something more than fear. "If they come," she said, her voice calm, steady, "I'll stand with you." He met her gaze, the truth heavy in his reply, "And I with you." No more needed to be spoken. The silence between them afterward was thick, not brittle, filled with the weight of two lives no longer braced to endure alone. Outside, the desert held its breath, the sky sharp with stars, the wind cold with the promise of snow. Inside, the cabin no longer felt like a place meant only to keep one man alive. It had become something larger, a sanctuary where exile and scars had forged a bond neither of them had expected, but both had chosen. And though the threat still lingered beyond the ridge, though the men who had once hunted her might yet return, the cabin walls now guarded more than survival. They guarded a vow made in silence, a vow stronger than any words could hold, that when the storm came, they would meet it together, shoulder to shoulder, unyielding. The wind carried winter's bite deeper with each passing night, but inside the cabin, something else had begun to grow, something that warmed the silence and made it feel less like emptiness and more like belonging. Elias noticed it first in the smallest of ways, in the way Sana sat nearer the fire now, not curled apart as she once had, but close enough that her shoulder brushed his when the wood popped and shadows danced. She no longer moved as though expecting to be sent away. She moved as though she had claimed her place, steady and unafraid. And Elias, who had built his life around solitude, found himself leaning toward her presence without meaning to. It was in the way he sharpened his knife slower when she came to sit beside him, in the way his eyes sought hers when the silence grew heavy. One night, as the wind rattled the shutters, he handed her the blade, and she turned it in her hands, tested the edge, then gave it back. She nodded once, and he felt it like a vow, unspoken yet binding. It was no longer just survival that tied them together. It was choice. The next evening, with the stars clear and sharp above, Elias opened a small wooden box he kept tucked in the drawer of his table. Inside lay a crow feather he had carried since the war, black and fine, its meaning uncertain even to him. He had kept it without knowing why, as though some part of him understood it, belonged to more than his own story. Without a word, he held it out to her. Sana looked up. her eyes widening in surprise, then softening with something that trembled at the edges of her silence. She accepted it with both hands, holding it carefully, as though it carried a weight she could feel in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice softer than the fire's hiss. It was only the third word she had spoken since stepping into his cabin, and Elias felt it strike deeper than any declaration could. She tucked the feather into her braid near her temple, and when she lifted her gaze again, there was a light in her eyes that had not been there before. Elias did not speak, but the heaviness in his chest told him he had just given her more than a token. He had given her a place in his life. From then on, their evenings carried a new warmth. She sat closer, sometimes shoulder to shoulder, sometimes resting her hand lightly on his as he cleaned the rifle by the door. Once, when her thumb brushed against his scarred knuckles, she said simply, "You don't have to fix me." Elias met her gaze and replied, "I'm not trying to." The silence after was full, not strained, their breaths mingling in the dim light. The world beyond the ridge might still come for them, but within those walls there was a beginning that neither dared to name, yet both had already chosen. Winter storms rolled harder, shaking the roof, but inside the cabin, their bond steadied like a fire, stoked against the wind. Elias noticed how her laughter began to surface faint but real, when he muttered about a stubborn hinge or cursed the draft near the stove. He noticed, too, how she wove new beads into the hem of her dress, neat and colorful, as if to remind herself that beauty could survive even in exile. He found himself speaking more than he had in years, small words, simple thoughts, but spoken aloud because she was there to hear them. She listened with her head bent, her eyes lifting just enough to show she valued every syllable. One night, the storm howled louder than usual, rattling the door in its frame. Elias laid his rifle across his lap while Sana swept the last embers into a glow. When she settled beside him, she looked at the weapon and then at him. "If they come," she said, her voice calm, "I'll fight." Elias turned to her, his jaw tight, his reply simple, "And I'll fight beside you." Their eyes held in the firelight, and something deeper than survival passed between them. She was no longer the hunted girl he had lifted onto his horse. She was the woman who had chosen to stand, and Elias knew that standing with her was not just duty, it was what he wanted. That night she moved her bedroll closer, pulling her blanket beside his cot. When her hand found his beneath the cover, cold but certain, he tightened his grip around hers, holding on as if the storm outside could test, but never break, what they had begun to build. Her head rested against his shoulder, and in that closeness, Elias felt the years of silence he had carried finally give way. He realized then that the quiet he had once dreaded was no longer empty. It was full, a shelter shaped by two lives that had chosen to meet in its center. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving frost glittering across the canyon. Elias stepped outside to breathe the sharp air, his arm aching but strong, the scar beneath its bandage a reminder of what had brought her into his life. Sana came out after him, her braid neat, the crow feather catching in the pale light. She stood beside him without a word, their shoulders brushing as the sun climbed slowly over the ridge. And though the land stretched vast and harsh around them, Elias felt for the first time that he was not facing it alone. The silence between them had become something larger, a vow that neither had spoken, but both understood, that whatever came down the trail, they would meet it together. The storm left its mark on the land, But within the cabin, the stillness had deepened into something stronger than shelter, something neither Elias nor Sana had thought they would ever find. Days folded into one another with the steady rhythm of work, each motion carrying the quiet weight of choice. Elias rose with the dawn, his scarred arms stiff but mending, and rode the ridge to check the trap lines, while the frost still clung silver to the grass. He returned to the scent of boiling water, the scrape of Sana's broom across the floor, or the sound of her low humming as she ground corn for bread. It astonished him sometimes, the way such simple sounds softened the walls that once echoed with nothing but his own breath. She did not move like a guest nor a captive. She moved like one who had decided the cabin was as much hers as his, shaping it with every stitch she placed in a torn quilt, with every pelt she cleaned by the fire. Elias, who had lived years in silence that cut like a blade, now found that the quiet between them felt different, no longer sharp, but steady, like earth beneath their feet. Their bond was woven not with grand declarations, but with the repetition of small, deliberate acts. When he returned from the ridge with a brace of rabbits, she salted the meat without needing to be told. When she carried water from the stream, he met her halfway to take the heavy pail from her hands. When the roof leaked one cold morning, they both worked in rhythm, he hammering patches of bark into place while she held the ladder, steady. Her eyes lifted to him, not with doubt, but with the quiet assurance that he would not fall. Evenings became their true language. After supper, she sat near him at the hearth, mending her dress or straightening the shelves, while he whittled or sharpened his blade. They spoke little, but in the way her eyes lifted to meet his, in the way she sometimes reached across the narrow space to brush his scarred hand with her calloused fingers, Elias felt something unspoken and unshakable growing between them. It was not the fragile truths of survival anymore. It was belonging. One afternoon, as Elias split logs in the yard, he caught sight of Sana standing near the corral, watching the horses graze. The crow feather he had given her stirred in the breeze, tied neatly into her braid, its black strand flashing against the beads at her temple. There was strength in the way she stood, feet firm, shoulders straight, no longer carrying herself as one pursued, but as a woman rooted. He leaned on his axe, studying her, realizing how far she had come from the silent figure he had lifted onto his horse. She turned then, her eyes catching his, and though no words passed between them, Elias felt the exchange like a spoken vow. This was no longer temporary. She was here because she had chosen to be. That night, as snow whispered against the shutters, she broke her silence with more than a handful of words. They sat across from each other at the table, steam rising from cups of coffee, when she looked at him and said, "They called me cursed because I refused to bow. Because I chose to walk away." Elias watched her face, the calm in her voice edged with steel. He set his cup down and met her gaze. "That's not a curse," he said. "That's freedom." She studied him, as if weighing the truth of his words against years of exile, and then her hand reached across the table, closing over his. Her grip was firm, steady, the gesture of someone who had learned to survive without touch, but was choosing now to give it. "You don't have to fix me," she murmured. "I'm not trying to, hun, Jiam," he answered. In the stillness that followed, her thumb brushed over his knuckles, and Elias knew they had crossed a threshold. The days turned colder, but the bond between them grew warmer, steadier. She no longer swept the hearth, as though filling the emptiness of another man's house. She swept it as though tending her own. He no longer sat by the fire as a man keeping watch over solitude. He sat as one who had someone beside him worth keeping watch for. He found himself speaking more often, not of the past he carried, but of small things. The repair the corral needed, the pattern of tracks near the ridge, the way the creek froze over in deeper winters. She listened, not with polite silence, but with intent, answering in small nods, in rare words, in the soft tilt of her head that told him she was not just hearing, but sharing. It was in these quiet exchanges, these repeated acts of living, that Elias realized his life had bent towards something he had thought long lost. Love was not a word he spoke aloud, not yet, but it was there in the way she rested her head against his shoulder at night, in the way he reached for her hand beneath the blanket without hesitation, in the way their silence had changed shape from a wall into a hearth. Outside, the desert remained merciless, the memory of men who had hunted her still lurking beyond the ridge. But inside, they had built something harder to break than fear. The cabin, once a place meant only to keep Elias alive, had become a sanctuary for two scarred lives, bound together. It was not peace, not fully, but it was a beginning. And in that beginning lay the promise of a future neither of them had dared to imagine. The season turned slow, the frost loosening its grip on the earth. And with it, Elias and Sana's quiet bond began to take on a shape that could no longer be mistaken for survival alone. They had built their days from repetition, water hauled, bread baked, fences mended. But it was in the nights that the truth of what they had become settled most deeply. The firelight painted her face in soft glow, beads glimmering at the ends of her braid, the crow feather dark against her temple. She no longer looked like a woman waiting for the world to strike her down. She looked like a woman standing within it unbent. And Elias, who once thought his scars and silence were all he had left to offer, began to feel the unfamiliar weight of wanting something beyond duty. One evening after supper, he set aside his knife and the strip of wood he had been shaping and pulled open a small tin box he kept hidden in the drawer. Inside lay a ring, silver, smooth, unpolished, carried from his mother's hand through years of dust and solitude. He turned it once between his fingers before looking at her across the table, the words slow, gravel in his throat. "I ain't got the right words," he said, voice low, "but if you'd stay as my wife, I'd be better for it." For a long moment, Sana said nothing. The fire popped, a log shifting. She looked at the ring, then at him, her dark eyes steady, unreadable, carrying all the weight of the roads she had walked alone. "You sure?" she asked finally, her voice soft but unwavering. Elias nodded once, simple as breath. "Never been more." She took the ring then, sliding it onto her finger with no hesitation. And when she lifted her gaze again, there was a glimmer in her eyes that spoke louder than tears. "I've already stayed," she said. "Now I'll stay for good." He leaned across the narrow table, kissed her first on the forehead, then on the lips, gentle but certain, the touch sealing what words could not. Her hands pressed against his chest, grounding him. And for the first time in years, Elias felt the weight of his heart settle into something solid. That night, after the fire had burned down to coals, they lay together beneath the patched quilt, no longer two figures near each other, but two bodies drawn close, breath mingling in the dark. She shifted against him, her back to his chest, his arm wrapping over her waist. And the silence carried no distance now, only belonging. He whispered against her hair, "I'm glad you're here." For a heartbeat, she did not answer, then turned to face him, her hand resting over the scar that marked his arm. "I love you," she said simply, her voice firm as stone. He blinked, his heart thudding heavy, then answered, rough and unpolished, but true, "I love you too." The words felt strange on his tongue, not from doubt, but from the ache of years gone without them. And as she leaned into him, her breath warm against his skin, he knew the silence between them had finally spoken. The days that followed moved with a new rhythm, heavier but brighter. Sana wore the ring without hiding it, her fingers brushing it as she kneaded bread or mended seams. Elias caught himself watching the silver glint in the firelight, a reminder that what had once been chance had become vow. They still rose before dawn, still tended horses and split wood, but there was a shift now, a fullness. They worked as one, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The cabin no longer felt like a fortress against loneliness. It felt like a home. When Elias rode to the ridge, Sana often went with him, her arms wrapped around his waist, her cheek resting against his shoulder, her presence turning the wide canyon from emptiness into shared ground. And when they returned, it was not just to eat and sleep, but to live together. One evening, as the wind softened with the promise of spring, Elias found himself reaching for her hand across the table, not because he feared she would leave, but because he wanted the steady weight of her palm against his. She gave it without question, her thumb brushing his knuckles, her eyes meeting his with a calm that spoke of permanence. Later, as they lay close, beneath the quilt she shifted, her voice quiet in the dark. "There's something else," she whispered. Elias turned, his heart tightening at the tone. She looked at him, eyes uncertain yet steady. "I think I'm carrying." For a moment the world stilled, the fire's glow, the wind's sigh, his own breath lodged in his chest. "You sure?" he asked. She nodded once. "Late by 2 moons. I feel it." Elias's hand, rough from years of work, reached for her, resting gently over her stomach. His voice was hoarse but steady. "All right," he said. "Then we build for more than 2. Her eyes filled, tears trembling but not falling, and she leaned into him, burying her face against his neck. He held her close, his arms tightening around her as though anchoring both of them against the weight of what was to come. They did not need ceremony, no vows beneath a preacher's hand. They had firewood to split, fences to mend, a roof to patch, and now more life to prepare for. In the hush of the cabin, with the ring glinting silver on her hand and his palm spread steady across her belly, the silence became something larger than both of them. It was not the silence of emptiness or fear. It was the silence of promise, of a future that neither exile nor scars could take away. Spring came slow to the canyon, shy at first, as though it needed proof that the land was ready to receive it. Frost still clung to the windows at dawn, delicate and fleeting, but by midday it melted into rivulets that streaked the hard earth with water. Tiny blue blossoms dared to bloom in the cracks of stone, and the creek, swollen with snowmelt, sang louder each day. Elias Ward stood on the porch, his scarred arm stiff but whole, a saddle strap in his hands, the smell of pine and turned soil thick in the air. Behind him, Sana stepped out of the cabin, carrying 2 tin cups of coffee, her deerskin dress restitched neat along the hem, the crow feather still tied into her braid. The silver ring caught sunlight as she held out the cup, and he took it with the faintest smile, tugging at his mouth. They stood together a long while, watching the horses graze, the silence between them comfortable, filled with something that no longer needed explanation. The cabin was no longer a place meant only to keep him alive. It had become theirs. Inside, her touch lingered everywhere. Quilts, mended with colorful thread, shelves scrubbed clean, beads threaded into cloth that brightened the plain corners. Outside, his hands shaped the land to hold them. Fences straightened, troughs filled, firewood stacked high. Each act was small, but together they formed the bones of a life. And though neither spoke of it often, both knew they were building more than shelter. They were building a home. For Elias, who had lived too many years with silence as his only companion, the simple weight of her presence at his side was miracle enough. For Sana, who had been cast out by her own and hunted by strangers, the cabin was proof that her refusal to bow had not been the end of her story. It had been the beginning. When they rode into Dust Vale that spring, it was not as hunter and fugitive, but as man and woman who had already chosen each other. The town had not changed. The same warped shutters on the saloon, the same cracked signs, the same wary eyes. But Elias felt different moving through it. Sana walked beside him, her chin high, her braid neat, the feather glinting dark against the sunlight. Men looked as men always would, but when one lingered too long, Elias stepped between them, his voice low and hard. "She's not yours to look at." The man glanced away, and they left without trouble, their saddlebags heavy with seed, salt, and sugar. Outside the town, with the desert stretching wide again, Sana's hand brushed his arm. A quiet signal that she understood his protectiveness, but that she was not afraid anymore. Together they rode home, and the land welcomed them with the smell of pine sap and wild flowers carried on the wind. That evening after supper, Elias drew out a small tin box from the drawer by the hearth. Inside lay his mother's ring, silver and simple, unpolished but enduring. He held it out to Sana, the firelight flickering across the curve of his scarred face. "I ain't got the right words," he said, his voice rough. "But if you'd stay as my wife, I'd be better for it." She looked at him long and steady, the way she always had, measuring the truth of him before she answered. Then she slid the ring onto her finger, the silver settling against her skin as though it had always belonged there. "I've already stayed," she said. "Now I'll stay for good." He leaned down, kissed her brow, then her lips, soft and certain. And in that moment, the silence between them broke open into something larger than words. The nights after that carried a new tenderness. She no longer slept curled apart by the hearth, but beside him, beneath the quilt patched from both their hands. Her head rested against his chest, her breath steady in the dark, her hand sometimes brushing over the scar on his arm, the mark he had earned when he stepped into the path of an arrow for her. And one night, when she shifted beneath the blanket, her voice soft but sure, she whispered, "I think I'm carrying." Elias felt the world halt around him. "You're sure?" he asked, his hand already reaching to rest against her stomach. She nodded. "Late by 2 moons. I feel it." For a moment, silence filled the cabin again, heavy with what could not yet be seen. Then Elias, who had never thought to live for more than 1 day at a time, said quietly, "All right. Then we build for more than 2. Tears shimmered in her eyes, but she buried her face against his neck, her body trembling with relief and fear, with hope. she had not dared to hold before. He held her close, steady as stone, his hand spread firm over her belly as though he could shield the life that had only just begun. The seasons shifted once more, and with them, their lives. Each morning, Elias rose to tend the horses, his arm whole but bearing its scar proudly, while Sanef tended to bread and broth, humming softly to herself. She moved through the cabin with ease now, no longer testing its walls, but shaping them as her own. At night, they sat by the fire, her head against his shoulder, his hand resting over hers, both of them knowing that the quiet around them was no longer a cage, but a shelter. The land beyond still carried its dangers, settlers with grudges, storms rolling down from the high ridges. But here, within the rough timber and stone, they had built a life worth guarding. And so the conclusion of their tale was not marked by victory or by battle, but by something rarer on the frontier, the promise of permanence. The man who once lived with silence as his only companion now shared it with a woman who had refused to bow. And together they filled it with trust, with touch, with the fire of a love neither had thought possible. The cabin, once a lone sentinel against loneliness, had become a sanctuary. The scar on his arm, once a mark of war and loss, was now the proof of a vow, the price he had paid to keep her alive, and the bond they had forged because of it. And the life growing inside her was the final sign that the future was no longer a hollow road. It was theirs, together. In the Arizona territory where dust and silence often swallowed whole the lives of men and women, Elias and Sana carved out a story of their own, not of surrender, not of exile, but of choosing again and again to stay.